Singapore companies are bracing for greater uncertainty after US President Donald Trump sends letters announcing new tariffs as high as 40% for some countries. The Singapore Business Federation says firms are once again taking a wait-and-see approach. SBF CEO Kok Ping Soon joins us today, along with Associate Professor Simon Tay, who is the chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Gentlemen, welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
Now, Simon, I want to start with you. Singapore is not among the 14 countries that were issued these letters by President Trump. So what does this mean? Can we assume that Singapore will remain at the 10% base tariff that was imposed in April?
If there was logic to it, Singapore is actually suffering a trade surplus. America enjoys surplus with us. So we shouldn't even be getting 10%. The fact that we're not getting a letter, it seems, we should remain there. But looking at the overall tumult, first, we're not sure what is on Trump's real mind. Second, even if we are spared anything more than 10% ourselves, the ripple effect of what happens to the countries around us, our major trading partners, is going to have an impact on Singapore.
And speaking of that ripple effect as well, Ping Soon, I want to bring you into this conversation. Many of those that are affected in this region, for instance, as you heard in the story earlier, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Laos, all in the region, they're very close trading partners with Singapore. So what does this mean for businesses to be operating in the neighbourhood where there's so many different tariff rates?
Thank you for that question. But I just wanted to add on to Simon that, this 10% that we have, for all it cares, it may not last for that long. And the reality, if you look at some of the content of the letters that he sent to the 14 countries, it just means that it is a calling shot for further trade deals. And I think it's that uncertainty that's really driving business interests because it sent a chilling effect on their ability to think ahead. The problem for businesses is that Trump operates on a very short cycle, every few days, but businesses operate on a much longer cycle. But as to your question on how Singapore businesses need to operate in this, I would say that because of all these changes and the differing tariff rates, for companies, trade compliance and regulatory fluency is no longer an option. It's almost a prerequisite for them to be resilient. Because if companies get the calculus wrong, it may likely suffer. And we're starting to see more companies stepping up to find out a little bit more about such issues. To give you a point of reference, we have trade advisors in the Center for Future of Trade and Investment. We call it C40. Q2 last year, we had about 60 advisories that we issued. And in Q2 this year, following the Liberation Day, the number of advisories that we issue increased by 1.5 times to 90 advisories. So more companies are starting to find out some of these things, which was not very sexy in the past. Now it's getting to be pretty sexy. And we encourage companies to step up, to find out more about what the FTAs can do to help them. Singapore is a network of 28 FTAs covering over 65 nations.
And as the companies are scrambling as well to find out what they should do in the course forward, how do these differing tariff rates in the region, Simon, I want to get to you, how does that affect any potential spillover effect in Singapore?
Well, it's a real damage in the sense that we as a hub in ASEAN really want the region to integrate. It's been emphasized by our Prime Minister. It makes a lot of economic logic, especially the neighbours nearest us. So this tariff differentiation tends to create a certain uncertainty, unlevel playing fields, and a bit of gaming, because who can get... It does make a difference if Malaysia gets 20-something and Vietnam gets 40-something. But having said that, I think there are some fundamentals. I agree with Ping Soon that we should be looking at some of these trade rules, intricacies, but there's also fundamentals that each country has a certain competitive advantage, and if companies need a certain factors of production, whether it's land or certain types of skill sets, it still makes logic to go out into the region. So I'm hoping that despite the uncertainty, these fundamental reasons why companies should integrate across ASEAN will continue.
Meanwhile,
add that point, I'd just like to remind the audience that we've been paying a lot of attention on the US. The reality is that as far as Singapore is concerned, our goods exports to the US is important, but it counts for less than 10% of our total goods export, which means there's a big 90% of the goods export that is not destined for the US, and there's a lot of potential there. And many of these opportunities are really in our immediate neighborhood, 700 million people, hence the importance of ASEAN integration.
Meanwhile, Ping Soon, do you feel that the businesses are starting to be a bit fearful or perhaps being more sensitive when it comes to being associated with the countries that are targeted more severely by the US tariffs?
I think there's a certain sense of worry. I think if the trade deal that US has with UK is of any guide, if you look at some of the texts they've written, I think US is prepared to give UK preferential for the pharmaceutical products, provided they have secured supply chain. Now, we do not know what secured supply chain actually means. It may well mean that they want to see the supply chain excluding goods from China. So I think companies need to start to rethink how they actually source and where they actually put some of their factories.
And if you look at the example of Vietnam, it's similar. There's a two-off tariff from Vietnam itself. 20% is not low, but it's not incredible. Yeah. But anytime they have China washing inputs from China, it's be 40. That's the report so far. So I think clearly rules of origin, like what Ministry of Trade and Industry does for local producers, have to be tightened up. There's no chain washing or China washing. You've got to be pretty transparent about where your inputs are coming from. You can't just cut a label and put made in Malaysia. It's not going to work anymore.
And also, Simon, with President Trump's latest letter saying that 1st August is the new deadline, we have to see there's also needed some room for negotiation. And do you think this is actually a feasible deadline, given that FTAs do take some time to negotiate? What is Trump really looking for here, especially when it comes to Singapore?
Well, I think, first of all, without playing too much of a psychologist, he has a certain sense of impatience, whether it is trying to solve the Ukraine issue or other issues. He's always setting these very impossible targets of kind of a CEO, create sense of urgency, rally people, move fast, and then take half an answer, take half the results and go home. I think that kind of impatience doesn't mean a really negotiated agreement. It's more like, come to DC, genuflect, I'll tell you what I want. I think he's really pushing for that.
Pingson,
I would say that, the whole trade policy now is like, the world is like a giant TV reality show now. Every day there's something happening and he's just trying to strike a deal. And that sort of things that he does just create the extreme uncertainty, persistent extreme uncertainty, and that's that's really hurting the business more than the tariff itself, actually.
And amid all that chaos as well, it did appear for a while that there was some reprieve from this. The tariffs were first announced in April, and then it was also delayed for about 90 days. So were Singapore companies able to capitalize on that time? Because you seem to think that they were taking more of a wait-and-see kind of approach.
Well, they're taking a wait-and-see for future investments, but during that 90 days period, for companies that have direct exposure to the US or indirect through intermediate goods, they do three things. I think number one, they're first of all discussing with the importers to see whether they can pass on the tariff fully or they need to absorb it or they do co-share. And that really depends on the leverage and who has the greatest leverage. The second thing that they're doing is actually accelerating some of the exports to the US to take good advantage of that 90 days. So a lot of front loading. And with the extension now to 1st August, you're going to see even more of that. But the third thing they're doing is really getting hold of the custom data, look at their supply chain much more closely and ask themselves, how do they qualify for the various rules of origin in different countries to benefit from the tariff arbitrage opportunity there are? And it requires a lot of assistance, because these are not things that companies have. Which goes back to my earlier point. For companies today, trade compliance, regulatory fluency are not optional. It is capability they need to build up in-house, or if not, get from the market.
And in that sense, the uncertainty isn't blanket. Companies that are more agile, able to navigate, switch customers, switch supply chains, they might do relatively well. Overall, of course, this sharp uncertainty is creating a lot of havoc. Additionally, I'm glad that ASEAN ministers have kind of united around calling this out, because the last thing we need is any one ASEAN country to kind of ripple through with the same idea. If a big market like Indonesia or India near us start doing the same thing, acting like a mini Trump, that's when the system really breaks down.
Right, and to also, I guess, create more clarity around the issue, if Pingsoon, you can tell us what the National Work or Task Force on US Tariffs has been discussing with businesses so far. Is there any action that the SBF is taking when it comes to assuaging the concerns of businesses?
I assume you're referring to the Singapore Economic Resilience Task Force?
Yes,
right. So SBF is privileged to be a member of this CERT headed by DPM Gan. They have set up 3 different work groups. Work group 1 is on sense making. Work group 2 is look at short-term solutions. And work group 3 look at long-term solutions. SBF is tasked to co-lead work group 1 on sensing. And that's what we've been doing. We've set up a feedback channel, with about 30 over TACs to regularly get inputs from them. And many of these roundtables have been held. And been feedback to the government that companies are having a wait and see, but there are certain areas that we hope government can consider support. I talk a lot about trade compliance, supply chain reconfiguration. Companies really need help because for big companies, they can do it on their own. But smaller companies, they may need to get help from trade lawyers, from trade expert, custom brokers. I think some form of assistance to help company will be necessary. Second thing that we feedback to government is that as you do a lot of front loading, companies may need access to working capital, trade financing. And again, we are feeding that back to government to see what they can do to help. But we believe companies have agency. Right? They can do things on their own, which is why we work with our partners to put together a playbook to help them decode the tariff, to help them to deepen their transformation and diversify markets. So it's a playbook that companies have put it out, and we're encouraging companies to refer to it.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
Thanks,
I've also been shedding a lot of spotlight on this issue as well, so thank you so much. There was Associate Professor Simon Tay from SIIA and also Kok Ping Soon from SPF.